Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your co-host. This is Berlin in the front lines, World War II and the Cold War, where Timothy Mulligan, our good friend, is going to be talking to us about the fascinating history of Berlin, Germany. So thanks so much for joining us. And with that, I will turn things over to Timothy. Timothy, it's all yours. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Robert. Sorry for the delay here, but technical difficulties are always a consideration. Welcome to this program, which was originally intended as a kind of an advertisement for a tour. My background, I worked at the National Archives for 34 years with World War II American and captured German records, World Wars I and II. I have my PhD from the University of Maryland. I've written 3 books, published about 25 articles, as well as the 3 books. And I also was a serving historian with National Geographic on D-Day tours from 2014 to 2019. And this was a possible tour of Berlin as a highlight for it, but COVID intervened. What I'm going to do tonight is give you a general history of Berlin, some specific history of Berlin during the National Socialist and World War II period, and then we'll see a sampling of images primarily from the World War II era, but including some from the Cold War. Hopefully, a lot of these will be new to many of you, but I'm sure it'll be familiar to others. Now, let's keep our fingers crossed that this works. Okay?
It works.
It works. Great.
We got it.
We got it. Great. Okay, so people have been living in the area of Berlin for at least 4,000 years. Between the years 900 to 1,000, those people were primarily Slavic background, and it was a Slavic fishing village on what is the island, the basic island that is the core of old Berlin. The fishing village was there because there's 2 rivers that are directly involved. The most direct river is the Spree, which runs east to west, basically, and then the Havel River, which is further to the west. The Spree empties into the Havel. That runs north-south and empties into the Elbe River. The Havel River comes from, the name comes from a Slavic derivation, the Hevel, okay? And the term Berlin, we believe, originated from a Slavic root word, with BRL as the basic component, meaning dry spot in a marsh. Okay, that's the origin of Berlin as best we can determine it. And of course, Berliners refer to the name as Berlin. And if you grow up there, that's your pronunciation. For convenience sake, I'll just stick with Berlin as we use it in the United States today. Now, around the years 1000 to 1200, that location became ethnically German. Now, what's interesting is the most recent archaeological research over the last 10 years, and including the beginning of this year, is altering our understanding of the German community that started what became Berlin. The original determined date of Berlin's birth officially is 1237, because that's the first time that you have a document or an artifact that reflects that date. And that's the traditional way of dating a town or city in Europe when you have some documentation that it exists, knowing that it existed before then, but that's the date you have to work with. 1237 has been that date for what is today the city of Berlin. But the new archaeological evidence, and that includes just this year, indicates that there was a German community there at least from 1150. Most probably as a colonial settlement that was set up by the Margrave of Brandenburg, and that's where this community belonged originally, part of Land Brandenburg, and the town that governed that area still exists as the city of Brandenburg today. But this was apparently dating back to 1150 as a German community, and chemical tests of the most recent and earliest identified grave sites in Berlin, and this was in East Berlin, where there are a lot of excavations going on, a lot of new building, and they're finding things that we might have otherwise found earlier, but now we're finding them. And the earliest grave sites indicate that the German inhabitants of 1150 Berlin were actually originally natives of Frankfurt and Fulda in West Germany, what is the old West Germany. It indicates that the Margrave of Brandenburg imported settlers from Western Germany as a colonial settlement in what was then still a kind of frontier area between the Slavic population and the Germanic population. What would happen is eventually this community would merge there were two towns originally, Berlin and Köln, C-O, umlaut over the O, L-L-N. Those two towns would eventually become one as Berlin. And eventually it would become part of the Hanseatic League as well, but in the early Middle Ages. It would become a regional trading center. So it was already starting to emerge because it was on a number of highways and roadways that were convenient, but they were not as important as like the Rhine and the Danube. This is why Berlin is a late developing capital, as the population data indicates. And I'll come back to that in a minute. In 1408, Mark Brandenburg became part of the possessions of an ambitious and rising royal house, the House of Hohenzollern, okay, based in what is today's Württemberg. That's their basic castle, the original one that they could claim. And this would begin a 510-year relationship between the Hohenzollerns and what would become the city of Berlin that would last down to 1918. The Hohenzollerns did not initially reside in Berlin, but when Berliners they're already starting to become an unruly bunch in the 15th century. And because they were a little late in paying taxes and objecting to these kind of absentee landlord problems, the royal family decided to build a castle and residence in the center of the town, a Schloss or castle. And this would eventually, in 1451, the Hohenzollern leader, the ruler, decided, I'm going to relocate to Berlin to keep it under control. And he takes up residence in the Schloss or castle, and that will eventually evolve into a royal palace that retains the name of the Schloss. That structure continues to exist all the way down, in some form, all the way down to 1950, when East German authorities demolished it and put in their own seat of government there. But after reunification, the Schloss has been rebuilt. It reopened just last year under a new name, the Humboldt Forum, named after the two brothers, Alexander and Wilhelm von Humboldt, who were both involved in natural sciences, arts, and such in the early 19th century. And today, the Humboldt Forum is a cultural center and a museum, especially for ethnology and art. Here is a comparison of the population data with that of London and Paris, the two other capitals. You can see how relatively small, as of 1618, Berlin is in terms of population against both London and Paris. It's also small in relation to many cities in the German states. For example, at this point, 1618, the population of Berlin is 1/4 that of the city of Augsburg. It's only 1/3 the population of Nuremberg or Hamburg or Bremen. So again, it's a late developing city. And the total you see here of 10,000, and actually 10 to 12,000 for 1618, that total will be reduced by half over the course of the 30 Years' War. It is not until the period of the late 17th and first half of the 18th centuries that Berlin begins to experience significant growth. In the 1670s and 1680s, the great elector, or Großer Kurfürst, Friedrich Wilhelm, invites Jewish merchant families who have been expelled from Vienna to settle in Berlin. He invites them there, settles them in. He later welcomes waves of French Huguenots who have been expelled from France, now all Catholic France. Although Frederick William is himself a Calvinist, and although his city is overwhelmingly Lutheran since the Reformation, nevertheless, it's going to have a significant Huguenot population that will gradually become integrated, but they'll keep their names. They'll keep French-sounding names all the way into the 20th century. The Prussian king, Frederick I, consolidates many communities around the core, what was old Berlin and Köln, into a single municipal entity in the early 1700s. And his grandson, Frederick II, Frederick the Great, promotes a major growth of urban industry through the manufacture of textiles, silk, woodworking, and porcelain. Frederick's results at the time of his death in 1786 are reflected in the population growth you see here. It's now up to 147,000 plus. Again, much smaller still than London or Paris. There is an old saying that the Hohenzollerns built Berlin, but they didn't build Berliners. We'll come to more of that a little bit later. After the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, Prussia accelerates into the Industrial Revolution and unifies the German states into a single nation following the Franco-Prussian War in 1870-71. And 6 years, just 6 years after that unification of Germany, Berlin's population reaches 1 million. It doubles to 2 million by 1905. Now you see Berlin is really on the track for the fast pace. The capital has now become an industrial city, especially in the fields, brand new fields of electrical engineering, machine works, and clothing, soon to be followed in the early 20th century by automobiles. It's going to be a major automobile factory area. And from the 1890s, Berlin is also a city of constant construction. It becomes a major center of the construction industry. That will continue through the end of Imperial Germany, all throughout Weimar, all through the Nazi period, through the history of West and East Germany, and up to including the present day. 120 years of relentless construction in the city of Berlin, regardless of regime, regardless of what the nature of the government is. World War I is very rough on Berlin, especially due to the effects of the British naval blockade and the sharp reductions in food rations that involves. The diet is greatly affected of everyone. There's a major rise of tuberculosis within the city. Child mortality between the ages of 6 and 15 increases by over 55%. In 1918, there's the influenza, the Spanish influenza pandemic hits Berlin. It'll kill 2,800 people in Berlin in the month of October 1918 alone. The armistice 1 month later, on November the 11th, might mark the end of fighting on the Western Front, but it signifies the beginning of street fighting in Berlin for the next 3 months between right and left. This is the reason, ultimately, why we refer to the period, the republic that existed from 1919 to 1933 as the Weimar Republic, because the brand new National Assembly, which creates a new constitution for a new Germany, cannot meet in Berlin. There's too much violence going on. Therefore, they go to the city, the closest major city of Weimar, and that's where they compose the constitution. And that's why we call it the Weimar Republic. Once relative peace is restored in 1920, the city of Berlin annexes 7 neighboring towns, including such significant ones as Spandau, Charlottenburg, Schöneberg, and others, as well as 59 rural parishes and 27 country estates. This doubles Berlin's population, as you see here, to over 4 million. And now Berlin is far beyond Paris, though it's still well behind London. And the Berlin of this time now assumes the outline of the city that we have all known today, ever since, especially the development of the Cold War. An area that's about 23 miles long, north to south, about 28 miles wide, east to west. And at a total size of 341 square miles, the city of Berlin is large enough to contain Munich, Stuttgart, and Frankfurt all together. Now, the advantages of this annexation of the neighboring lands, which are mostly to the west, are numerous. First of all, it increases the tax base. That's because these communities like Charlottenburg and Spandau and Schöneberg, they're affluent. People there have a lot of money. So you're expanding your tax base. You're integrating and consolidating, finally, all these different regional transportation networks into one single integrated transportation system. And you add many more open spaces around lakes and woods to the west as urban escape areas. It's been argued, though, that the most important reason for the annexation of these areas to the west was to dilute the political strength of the left in the old city of Berlin. And that brings us to a discussion of Berlin and the rise of National Socialism. Okay, here's a chart of Reichstag election results for Berlin, 1924 to 32, in terms of percentage of the overall vote cast. It's interesting for me as a historian to observe how today's writers and historians continue to invoke World War II propaganda images of Berlin as if it applied to Berlin. You could still say it today of Berlin of World War II. Phrases such as the black heart of the Nazi Empire, the Garden of Beasts, and such, very typical. Hyperbole is fine for selling books, but we need to be aware of the historical facts of how Berlin voted in the last years before the Nazis took over. And this tells you exactly how. I don't know if we can move, I don't know if you can see the last column there, but sorry. What was, let me start, first of all, what city was the birthplace of National Socialism in Germany? Well, a big hint is the city that referred to itself as the Hauptstadt der Bewegung, that is, the capital city of the Nazi movement. That city was Munich, okay? That's where the Nazi Party was founded. In 1924, the number of dues-paying members of the Nazi Party amounted to 55,000 in Bavaria. How many were there in Berlin at the same year? 400. On the chart here, you see these voting results for Berlin. I wish we could move this out, but I'm sorry. Really sorry you can't see the last column there. I think that this is blocking it, but I'll just try. At least you can see some of the results earlier. And again, remember that the Nazi Adolf Hitler never, in any free election during the Weimar Republic, and up to the time he was appointed chancellor, he never got 50% or more of the German voting republic. His height was, as you see here, in 1932, he got 33%. This is the national percentage at the end of 1932. But you see for Berlin, these figures for the Social Democrats, the SPD, and the Communist Party, the KPD, they're much larger than the national averages. And they remain pretty constant. There's movement between the two. During the time of relative prosperity, the Social Democrats are always in greater numbers. Once the Depression hits, starting in late 29, early 30, then you start to see the communists catching up. And at the end here, November 32, the Communist Party actually has more votes than the Social Democrats. But the total for the two is 54%. And you see that figure is pretty constant from 1924 on. The four parties you see here, these are center and right-wing parties. They're all defined down here. These parties contributed between 35–40% of the overall vote in Berlin during the years of relative prosperity, where you could choose by what degree you were centrist or right-wing, only to collapse once the Depression hits. Okay, as we see here, 24 to 28, that's their peak years. And then they begin to decline. And those votes generally shift down to the Nazi Party. That's where the Nazis gain their strength from. The center and right-wing people turning to the Nazis. And here we see the Nazi Party vote. All right, May of 1924, less than 5%. Within 7 months, that's been reduced by more than half, down to 2%. May of 28, the period of the greatest relative economic stability, 1.5%. Then the Depression hits. Then it goes up to 14.6, doubles again in less than 2 years. And although I don't think you can quite see it here, it actually declined. It's down to 26% in November of 1932. Okay, it's interesting in this regard that the Nazi Party in 4 months goes down almost 3 percentage points in the overall voting in Berlin in 4 months, a decline of almost 10% of those who had earlier voted. What they do is they start going back to their old right-wing parties and center parties. So I would argue that the growing strength of the Communist Party, which continued to increase from July to November 1932, versus the relative decline of the Nazi Party over those same 4 months, is one of the factors that influences the traditional German political leaders, including President von Hindenburg, and especially Chancellor Franz von Papen. Let's bring in the Nazis because their moment may be fading. We've got to take advantage of them while they still have some voting power. But the communists are still gaining strength. This is why we need to bring the Nazis into power before they lose more votes. Again, that's an area of history that needs more investigation, but is worth noting. And again, although again, we can't quite see it, the total voting pattern for the Social Democrats and the Communists in the last free election of November 1932, it's 54%. 54% of the total of those who voted. And as you can see, their participation, 81% of the eligible voters, 81% voted. And 54% of those who voted for the Social Democrats or the Communists. It's a pity they could never combine to block the Nazis at the national level. In Berlin, they certainly could have blocked the NSDAP. But what's also interesting to note is that in the last election, which was a year ago, September 2021, the winners, the three parties that are now form the governing coalition for the city of Berlin, it's the Social Democrats, it's the Left Party, which is the direct successor to the Communist Party, and the Greens, who are kind of a hybrid of both. And what was their percentage total in the September 2021 elections? 54%. Okay, and as you can see, the totals here for the Social Democrats and especially for the Communists are not reflective of Germany as a whole. This is what the average was throughout the country. The Nazi Party was much stronger in the rest of Germany than it was in Berlin. The Communist Party was much stronger in Berlin than it was anywhere else in Germany. And the Social Democrats were nowhere else as strong as they were in Berlin.
Tim, we've already had a couple questions, and I'll hold off those till
we can
later.
hold off on those.
They were just more generic questions. But someone asked, will you be talking about why they grew so quickly, the Nazi Party, in that like 4-year span?
Yeah, the most basic reason is because of this. The most basic reason is the Depression. That with the American Depression that began in October 1929, which then had ripple effects, those ripple effects did not have much effect in Britain or France, except in long-term ways. It had a direct result in Germany, because what was propping up a fragile German economy were short-term American loans. Those short-term loans evaporate with the American Depression. That means that almost overnight, the economy collapses. And the government, in trying to deal with these things, pursued a policy of social austerity, which included things like, retired bureaucrats, retired federal workers were going to cut your pensions by 25%. That leads to a growth of people in general who say, this government doesn't work. This form of government doesn't work. We need one man who can fix this. Only one man can fix this. We need to work with him. And why older retirees and pensioners become more susceptible to a strongman approach as well. That's the most basic reason. Perhaps we can go into more of that in the quick Q&A.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so here now we're in World War II, and we're going to talk a little bit about the losses of Berlin's civilian population. You see here that deaths due to the bombing raids, which lasted over 5 years, an estimated 52,000 deaths. Those occur over 314 recorded Allied air raids on the city of Berlin. Okay, they destroy about 10 square miles, mostly in the center of the city. There are attempts to try to create a firestorm, as occurred in Hamburg and Dresden, but because Berlin is a much more modern city with many fewer old medieval type streets, but with broad avenues intended for automobiles and buses and mass transport, fires can't bridge those wide avenues as they could in Hamburg and Dresden. And therefore, the attempts by the British and Americans to create a firestorm in Berlin never come to fruition, as it were. Nevertheless, 52,000 people are killed in the bombing raids. But note that however destructive those may seem, look at the number of deaths in the basically like 10 to 12 days of the Battle of Berlin. The battle actually begins, April 19th, April 20th, whether you, depending on where you say the Soviet forces reached the suburbs of Berlin, and ended May the 2nd. Look at the number of deaths compared to the bombing rates. Incredible. And that, of course, also brings us to the question of the fate of Berlin's Jewish population. Berlin had the largest Jewish population of any city in Germany at that time, 163,000 in 1933 when Hitler came to power. You see, the majority survived through emigration, which was the initial Nazi policy, force Jews to leave Germany. And Berlin's Jews tended to be fairly well-to-do. They could afford to do it, but it meant that they lost most of their possessions in order to buy their way to emigration. So 90,000 emigrated, some of whom would be then caught up once the Nazi state was able to conquer much of Europe. Then they're caught up in the death machine and killed in any case. But 90,000 escaped by 1939. About 7,000 committed suicide, especially older people. And then you had about 55,000 who were deported to the camps. And the interesting thing is here, this mostly occurred all in the period of 1943. Up to 1943, Jews could still live in Berlin. They were restricted, they were registered, but they were still able to move around openly in the city of Berlin to some extent. And then in 1943, that is the year when basically the remaining Jewish population of Berlin is murdered to the extent that it could be. Most of them die within 16 months, most in Auschwitz or Theresienstadt. And here you see those who actually survived. 4,700 by marrying Aryans, whatever that was, were able to survive because of the virtue of their marriage status. 1,900, 57,000 deported, 1,900 were still alive in the camps when they were liberated. And 1,400, amazingly, 1,400 Jews were still in Berlin, basically living in hiding. Many referred to themselves as U-boats, that they would come to the surface only when they needed to get something and then disappear again below the surface. So those are the totals that we have approximately for the Jewish population of Berlin. Here we see the front of the Reichstag today, as it looks today, after the remodeling with the glass cupola by British architect Norman Foster. This structure, it's important to keep in mind, this is younger than the US Capitol building. It's younger than the White House or the US Treasury. It was built between 1884 and 1894. It was the seat of the national parliament, the Reichstag, today the Bundestag. The first parliament was held here in December 1894, and it was notorious for being burned on the night of February 27th to 28th, 1933, less than a month after Hitler came to power. It's still argued about how it happened, who did it. But the historical evidence at the moment still seems to indicate the man who said he'd burned it, Marius van der Lubbe, who was a somewhat disturbed Dutch communist. In any case, the Reichstag, from that point on, is irrelevant in Nazi Germany. The Nazis only repair part of the building. They use it for exhibitions of art, of degenerate art, of Aryan art, of captured weapons and that kind of thing, but it's really meaningless in Nazi Germany. But when Soviet forces storm the city, this is the key point they're going after, because it's the counterpart to the Kremlin. And if you capture the Reichstag, you've captured Germany. So this becomes the focal point of all Soviet attacks on the city in April of 1945. This is the view we have here, is the view that Soviet forces would have had as they approached the Reichstag, beginning on April 30th, 1945, even as Adolf Hitler is committing suicide in his bunker. They captured most of the building in the course of fighting April 30th and May 1st, but there were still German forces inside the building fighting when the surrender of the city took place May the 2nd, along with the general surrender. This is the iconic image of the fall of Berlin, and certainly recognizable to every Russian school child who's been brought up with this, the raising of the Soviet flag on the roof of the Reichstag. This is a reenactment on the morning of May the 2nd of an event which took place the previous evening. But because it was dark, you couldn't really photograph it to effect. So it was reenacted on the morning of May 2nd after German forces had surrendered. The photo was taken by Soviet war correspondent Yevgeny Kadai, and it portrays Sergeant Milton Kantaria here holding the flag, assisted by Sergeant Yegorov and another sergeant who's not in the picture named Samsonov. And this photo, as Kadai later explained after the end of the Soviet era, he retouched it. So it's not only a reenactment, but it's a retouched reenactment photo. First, he added the smoke plumes here from a different photograph taken elsewhere in Berlin, it suggests the immediacy of the combat. It suggests fighting in the city of Berlin. But actually, these plumes come from a different location. They were not there. They're not visible from the Reichstag on the morning of May the 2nd. Secondly, it also he retouched to remove the multiple wristwatches that were on the wrist of Sergeant Yegorov here, because it revealed that obviously he'd been looting some wristwatches while he was on his way to the Reichstag. So he whited them out, as it were. And finally, Kadai added the billowing Soviet flag here. And the people all remembered, no, there was no real wind in Berlin on the morning of May the 2nd. And it certainly is not the same flag which you will see displayed at the Armed Forces Museum in Moscow today. If you could visit Moscow today, I'm sure some of you have been to Moscow and might have seen the original flag that was raised, but it's not nearly as photogenic and doesn't have the distinctive oversized symbols that you see there. So how do we find where this photo was taken? Well, let's go back to the moment. You see here, Sergeant Kantaria is standing on one of these flying buttresses. There's another buttress here to his right. And here, again, we're in the middle, there's a figure, a statue of a German emperor from the past. And you can see his left leg is kind of thrust forward. There's his foot. Okay, well, there is that statue. And this is the buttress where Kantaria was. And Kadai was up around here taking the photograph. And this is facing eastward into the city. So there's nothing that tells you this is the location. I had to figure it out. But this statue delineates exactly the location, as we need to know. Okay, this is the Moltke Bridge, the Moltke Brücke. This is the bridge over the Spree. It's very near today's Hauptbahnhof, the main train station, en route toward the Reichstag. The Reichstag is in this direction. And this is the bridge that Soviet forces crossed to get across the bridge to attack the Reichstag. The bridge was blown in the middle, but the Soviets were able to put together some bridging material to get across. And you see here reconstructions of the original Griffin monuments from the late 19th century, which stood on the Moltke Bridge. Very, very heavy fighting took place here. This is a view. The bridge was completely restored to look like what it looked like in 1912, 1910 or so. Okay. And in here, there is a plaque that describes the fighting that took place crossing here, the Spree, at this location when the Soviet Third Shock Army fought its way across the Spree en route to the Reichstag on the other side. The commemorative plaque is right inside there. However, it is completely obscured by graffiti. As you can see, part of the side of it, it was not worth taking a photograph of because it would not be decipherable. But there is a much better monument to the fighting that took place at this location, which you see here. This is one of the original Griffin figures that stood on the bridge on the morning of April 30th, 1945. And you can see the battle damage that it suffered. And it is there, it is maintained there. As we'll see in other examples, this is maintained as a relic of the Battle of Berlin and of the war itself. Preserved at the base of the bridge. Now here we are on the Wilhelmstrasse, which from 1871 through 1945 was the government center, the center of government along this road in Berlin, the Wilhelmstrasse. This is where all the key ministries of government were located. And at this location here to our left, which is today a very modest apartment building with a parking lane, little shops on the ground floor, and residences up there on multiple stories. This was the seat of the old Reich Chancellery. This is where Otto von Bismarck occupied the first office of Chancellor of the new unified Germany. This is where Bethmann Hollweg understood but could not stop Germany's defeat in World War I. And it was at this location that all 12 of the chancellors of the Weimar Republic sat. And you see here a photograph of what the building looked like at the time. See, it's complete, the configuration is completely changed. The street is more narrow than it ever was before. But you see this image here. Well, this is what that image actually looked like at the time. You can see the street is much broader. The residence for the chancellor was over here to the right, and this was the office part of the chancellor's government, the seat of government. This photo is taken probably late 1934, early 1935. And the most significant addition to this building is this little balcony here. This balcony was added in 1934 at the specific request of Adolf Hitler, and it was erected by Albert Speer, his architect, so that Hitler and others of his entourage could receive the salute of brown shirts and other Nazi party organizations as they marched by with flaming torches on the Wilhelmstrasse in the 1930s. Okay. Now, a little bit further on, we come to the one spot that every English-speaking tourist will always visit when they get to Berlin, and that is the location of the Führer bunker, and where Hitler took his life, along with, and Eva Braun did too, in April 30th, 1945, as portrayed in so many, many films and TV documentaries. And this is the location, this is how it is commemorated. There's a very detailed explanation of what the buildings were in the vicinity, how the bunker appeared, and photographs from the time. And this shows you where that is located, what is now an open space. And this space was actually fairly open back during actually from the Weimar Republic through Nazi Germany. This was in the garden area behind the government buildings. What you see here are, again, these new residential apartments located where the new Reich Chancellery was located. The old Reich Chancellery would have been on the other side of this building, facing that direction. The new Reich Chancellery was here, facing that direction. But this was open ground back then, as it is today, though today it is a playground and parking lot. The Führer bunker that was portrayed there probably extended underground up to about the spot of where the sidewalk is. And where Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies are taken out and burned was right behind the perspective of the camera, probably in the middle of this street, which was not there at the time. Now, if we go down, walk down from that location, you'd come to this intersection of that small street we were on with Vossstrasse. This street, which we see here, where we were, this is the street of Gertrud Kolmarstrasse. Gertrud Kolmar was a 48-year-old native Berliner, teacher, poet, Jewish, deported to Auschwitz in March of 1943 and died date unknown. But a new street was built after Berlin was unified and named for her. And it comes down through here and intersects with Vossstrasse. This street here was at one time, this is a very old street, much wider than it is today. We are looking west down Vossstrasse toward what will eventually be the area of Potsdamer Platz, which is further to the left. And as you can see, you have all these, again, same kind of apartment buildings you had where the old Reich Chancellery was located, same kind of format, residential, shops, parking lane, bicycle parking lanes. But it looked very different during the Nazi period. This is the same view looking back down. This is looking east. Again, you get a better view of these residential apartment buildings. But where these buildings are today looked very different in 1930, from 1939 to 1945. They look like this. This was the new Reich Chancellery, which Hitler ordered to be built January 1938, January 1939. You can see the human scale by the two guards here to this entrance. This is Vossstrasse here. And these two guards suggest the human side, the human dimension to the size of the Reich Chancellor, the new Reich Chancellor. A building obviously meant to intimidate, to awe, and to reduce the individual to the kind of proportions that dictatorships prefer. Ironically, this brand new Reich Chancellery that Hitler was so proud of, he spent very little time here. Hitler spent very little time in Berlin, period. He didn't really like the city that much. So once the war started, he would mostly spend his time at the headquarters in East Prussia, the Wolfschanze. If he wasn't there, he'd go to Berchtesgaden. He would only spend time in Berlin as needed for various functions. This building, which was intended to be his main office building, he did very little work here. This was basically a place for official functions where he would receive diplomats, receive guests, Nazi party functions, award decorations to German war heroes, and so forth. Mostly he lived, ironically, in the old Reich Chancellery because the living quarters there were a bit more accommodating, a bit more human. So that's where he actually was when he was in Berlin, but that wasn't very much. Now let's return to that previous photo. Okay, if you were to follow this gentleman, approach the camera and go about 25, 30 feet beyond where he's standing now, this would be your view. Here is Vossstrasse coming into Ebertstrasse. Okay, this is a very historic street. In 1900, this street was Königgrätzer Straße. After the German military victory at Königgrätz, which sealed Prussia's victory over Austria in the 7 Weeks' War in 1866. In 1925, it was renamed Ebertstrasse after the first president of the Weimar Republic, Friedrich Ebert, who died in office in 1925, and the street was renamed for him. 1933, the street's renamed again to Hermann Göring Strasse. I don't need to explain who he was. After the end of the war, it reverts to being Ebertstrasse, but it has little use, especially from 1961 on. In August of 61, the wall is built. If you want to know where the wall was at this time, you see that the wet space right there on the far end of the opposite lane, the one-way lane, that's where the wall was. The wall ran right along where that sidewalk is today. And where we are, you couldn't be because you'd be in the middle of the dead zone. The wall marked the far limit of East Berlin, and everything on this side was progressively cleared further east to create a killing zone to prevent people from escaping East Berlin. So where we're looking now, this would have been a desolate area of bare earth with minefields, with barbed wire, with paths for guards and dogs, sound devices buried in the ground to pick up sounds of tunneling, and guard towers with searchlights nearby. Okay, this is the one space where the Nazi past of Berlin shares the same space with the communist past of Berlin. And ironically, today they share that same space with a Starbucks. Okay, the next set of images shift to a different neighborhood. This is near Tempelhof Airport. And beginning with the residents here at 2 Schulenburg Ring. You see the address there? This is a very affluent area of Berlin. It was a much more affluent area at the time, in the 20th century. In late April 1945, this building served as the forward command post of Soviet General Vasily Chuikov, commander of the Soviet 8th Guards Army. 2 years and 7 months earlier, Chuikov and this same army were defending the streets and factories of Stalingrad. And now, after a victorious advance of almost exactly 1,000 miles, they were about to complete their odyssey by capturing the German capital. And just before 11 p.m. on the evening of May 1st, 1945, General Helmut Weidling, who had been appointed commander of the German forces in the city of Berlin against his will. Hitler had directly appointed him, ordering him to report to his headquarters, planning to arrest him and possibly shoot him for retreating in the face of Soviet forces. And Weidling explained to Hitler, well, if you want to shoot me, go ahead. But we were overwhelmed by Soviet forces. We had no choice but to withdraw. And we did withdraw successfully. And he made his case so convincingly that Hitler decided, I'm going to appoint you commander of the garrison of Berlin against all his wills. Weidling would walk through these doors to meet with Chuikov and surrender the forces in the early morning hours of May the 2nd, 1945. And you see here a plaque on the wall that describes exactly that event on the morning of May the 2nd. This used to be a much shorter plaque. There was a plaque here with much shorter information, which simply said, this is where the surrender took place. Well, now that you've had new generations of Berliners growing up, you need to explain who surrendered to whom and what time it was and why it's important. But there's an additional importance to this location. As we pan back here, there's the plaque, there are the doors, but you see these little brass markers on the sidewalk. What are those? Now here's what those 3 plaques are. These bronze plaques are known as Stolpersteine, literally stumbling stones or stumbling blocks. And they commemorate individual victims of the Holocaust at a location that's appropriate to those particular individuals. Of course, in the center of Berlin, you have the memorial to the murdered Jews of Europe, which is very impressive, very depressing, but it is a major monument. This is a different kind of monument that looks at individuals and commemorates individuals where they were. And we see that the residence that Chuikov chose as his command post that would ultimately be the location of the German surrender, was originally the home of the Grunwalds, Arthur and Rosa. Arthur born in 1889, his wife born in 1887, deported 1943, murdered in Auschwitz. Their son, Karl, born in 1927, deported 1943, murdered in Theresienstadt. At least they have a specific date there of March 23rd, 1945. So you will find these Stolpersteine scattered throughout Berlin. They represent the work of an artist, initially one artist named Gunther Demnig, who did this entirely on his own. Initially, Berlin city authorities said, well, that's defacing public property. He's got to be fined and punished for that. And then the city authorities, after talking to people, said, that's actually a pretty good idea. So today there are over 5,000 of these Stolpersteine in the city of Berlin. And there are over 75,000 of them all over Europe and elsewhere around the world. The cost, if you can pay for these to be established, you can be the sponsor of one of them. Each costs about 120 euros, or approximately $140, $145. I think it's one of the best ways to commemorate individuals that I've encountered yet. Well, there are, of course, everyone who visits Potsdam, just southwest of Berlin, is going to visit Frederick the Great's Sanssouci. And if you've been to Berlin, for those people who have, I know most of you have probably been to Sanssouci. How many of you have been to the Cäcilienhof, which is not too far away, which we see here? This was the royal residence built for Kaiser Wilhelm II's eldest son, Crown Prince Wilhelm, and his wife, the Grand Duchess of Mecklenburg-Schwerin, Cecily. Hence the name, the Cäcilienhof. Built in the style of the English Tudor manor, ironically built 1914 to 1917, at the height of World War I. The royal family did not get to live here very long because they left with Kaiser Wilhelm's abdication in November of 1918. But in 1923, they were allowed to return and maintain a right of residence with the understanding that the property was now state property. They could not alter the place. They could not make major changes. It was not their property. They were invited back by the Weimar government if they wanted to reside there. I don't think they did for very long. I think they went back symbolically, but then they got another place. And the reason it was selected is because when the Soviet forces advanced, they were able to basically clear Potsdam with little fighting. So this residence was almost untouched, and it becomes the location for the Big Three, and they're meeting at Potsdam in July 1945. Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, President Harry Truman, and initially Prime Minister Winston Churchill, although he will depart after British elections in July 1945, remove the Tory party from power, and Clement Attlee replaces him as Prime Minister, and he's here. So these meetings took place July 17th to August the 2nd, 1945. And at least one of the major historians of the Potsdam Conference has said, this is the building where you could argue the Cold War began, with Stalin and Truman verbally sparring with each other, especially over the testing and initial proof of the atomic bomb and the role of the Soviet Union in entering the war against Japan. Now, only a few hundred yards away from where Chuikov's headquarters was is this very nice memorial, the Berlin Airlift Memorial, commemorating the efforts of British and American airmen to keep the population of Berlin supplied during the Soviet blockade of all the land routes leading into Berlin from June 1948 to May 1949. During this period, British and American airmen flew in 1.5 million tons of coal, 800,000 tons of food. In one day, they were able to fly in, there were 1,300 separate flights were able to land on a single day. That was the record, landing at Berlin. And Tempelhof Airport was the largest airport that was being used. All the different airports, such as Gotto, they were all being used by the British and Americans, but Tempelhof was the primary one. And that's where this memorial was erected. And at the base here, you have recorded the names of 39 British, 31 American airmen, and 5 German civilians who perished in crashes during the course of these flights over that time period. There was a major commemoration here back in 2019 on the occasion of the anniversary. In fact, earlier this year, Lieutenant Gail Halverson died. Just this year, 2022. Halverson was one of the candy bombers. That is, he and his crew loaded their plane on more than one occasion with candy and fixed them with small parachutes so they could be dropped for the children of Berlin to have candy. On one flight, they were able to carry 23 tons of candy to be dropped for the children. So he was known as the original candy bomber. And he attended that ceremony in 2019, died again just earlier this year. Last, we have here a photo of the Berlin Wall Memorial at Bernauer Straße, selected for the key drama that took place here in the early days of the wall's erection in August of 1961. Bernauer Straße, which is actually out here, you see there, was the location of a very high apartment building. The building itself was in East Berlin. The sidewalk was in West Berlin. And you had a key drama take place here, especially the first days when the wall was erected, of the people in the apartment building jumping out onto the sidewalk below because they would be in West Berlin when they did so. And you have memorable images of people who have actually been caught outside their windows. East German police have them by the arms and wrists and are trying to pull them back in. And West Berliners are grabbing at their feet to try to pull them down onto the sidewalk so they'll be free. So the best images. Here is the one place in Berlin where they have restored the appearance of the Berlin Wall as it looked, especially in the later days. And again, the Soviets just kept, the East Germans kept progressively improving, spending more money on the wall and moving the protective area further to the east so they have clearer killing zones. So again, Bernauer Strasse, if you have not visited it, is definitely worth to visit. It has a separate memorial to all those who died crossing the wall. Today's capital might not be recognized by those of us who visited in the 70s and 80s, not recognized by those of us who might have been there at the end of World War II, and those of us who can remember that are becoming very few. The wall that you see here is only a reproduction. The main wall itself is gone. Hitler's Reich Chancellery is gone. But you don't have to look far to see the bullet holes that remain on public buildings in downtown. If you go to the Museum Insel, you'll see the bullet holes all along museum buildings there. They were not repaired. They were left as reminders of what happened there in 1945 and what happened more generally as a result of the Second World War. And you still stumble across throughout Berlin the Stolpersteine and the people, the individuals whom they commemorate. The voting patterns, as I mentioned, remain strikingly similar after 90 years. Berlin today is a new city, but then Berlin has been a new city several times in its history. But its past is always present. Thank you.
All right, Timothy, bravo. That was awesome. Thank you. Greatly appreciate that information. We had a lot of questions and comments come up from the audience. So do you have time to maybe go through a few questions?
Sure, I'm happy to, sure.
Okay, terrific. So let's see. The first one, we were, you couldn't see all this while you were talking, but we were having a lively discussion on Berlin-themed films throughout history. And it seemed like the recommendations that, I'll ask you what your thoughts are in just a minute, but just from the audience, the recommendations were Cabaret got a few votes, Atomic Blonde, Wings of Desire got a couple votes, Berlin Tunnel, Berlin I Love You, The Lives of Others, Germany Year Zero, Goodbye Lenin, Babylon, Berlin, and then a film that I recommend was Sophie Scholl, The Final Days.
Yes, yes.
A Woman in Berlin is a very good movie, although it's very disturbing. And then
Yeah.
Downfall. There was a few folks. What about yourself? Any Berlin themed films that you particularly enjoyed or recommend?
Downfall is definitely the best of the genre of Hitler's last days. And that's become a cultural icon, of course, because anyone who's on Facebook or YouTube knows about
the YouTube recreations.
The Hitler rants parodies. The latest one is on Texas A&M if you're an Aggie fan. But yeah,
the last one I saw was Hitler ranting about Elon Musk taking over Twitter.
Yeah, that may be even more current than the Texas A&M. So yes, and that stuff's going to keep going. But that was an outstanding performance by Bruno Ganz, and it is a faithful reconstruction, as best as we can, of how things looked, how cramped things were in the bunker. So yeah, I definitely recommend that if you're interested in Berlin at the End. That's the film to see. All those Lives of Others is my favorite for life in East Berlin and the role of the Stasi. Although it's a fiction story, and it captures Berlin in the immediate aftermath of reunification.
Lives of Others, for those not familiar, it's a film about how the East Germans spied on their citizens to make sure that they didn't escape over to the West.
Beautiful, beautiful film. Cabaret is good. I thought it was very good. Not so much for the story. I never really got into. I could not believe that Sally Bowles would be relegated to not being, well, she's not really a good singer. When you hear her sing it, obviously she's a good singer. Why? So I never got into the main plot of Cabaret, but the background, if you watch, the next time it's on, just kind of look beyond the main characters and notice the walls, notice the placards that are on the walls. Notice the signs, notice where things are run down. That is a beautiful recreation of Berlin, and it was filmed in West Berlin. There are locations where you can go. This is where Sally Bowles and her boyfriend stood and waited for the S-Bahn train to go overhead. You can go and stand in that spot. And so there are aspects of that film that I really, really appreciate for the background and for the atmosphere of that. But again, saying that it's symbolic, but again, the Nazis were never that prevalent in Berlin beyond certain areas. So those are be my favorite picks.
Okay. Let's see. So periodically our group streams films, like usually historical type film. I was actually thinking about streaming Downfall at some point in time in the future, like maybe next spring, but we'll have to see how it goes. And then A Woman in Berlin is a really good film. It's really disturbing. It's about women trying to survive after the end of World War II.
The rape rate was huge.
Yeah, so interesting, but very disturbing. And then I've not seen Germany Year Zero, although I'm familiar with that film. And so I should go check that out because that's very hard.
It's kind of hard to get. Stunde Deutschland, Germany, Stunde Null. They kept Germany, I think, in English, and then Stunde Null, Year Zero. There are some good films, excuse me, from the interwar period, in the period after. Well, there are good interwar year films too. There are some good films in the period when actually it was East Germans were actually running the film studios, but they weren't overdoing it on the propaganda measure, the late 40s. There are some good films there, and there's a film center that distributes some of those old East German films that from that early period, late 40s, early 50s. They'd be worth looking at too, although you always have to keep in mind the point of view.
Okay, no problem. And then what about, this is a question from Stevie asked, did also the way Germany was treated and split up after World War I have something to do with how the Nazis were able to take a foothold?
Well, you have to remember, at the end of World War I, Germany was not split up. That's what the French wanted to do. The French wanted to split up Germany. But Britain and the United States both realized that made no sense from an economic point of view. You needed to keep a basic German entity as an economic bloc to keep maintaining, because Britain had been Germany's major trade partner up to 1914. And the British were very much interested in, trying to get trade relations resumed. So Germany was not split up, although the Rhineland was demilitarized and occupied for 14 years by the French. And that was a sore point that Hitler never stopped beating on all through the period of the Weimar Republic, that we are not masters of our own fate. They still occupy a part of German soil, that it will always be German soil. That was part of it. But the terms of the Versailles Treaty, in terms of reparations were a far greater issue that Hitler could build on than anything about this geographic splitting up of Germany. Germany lost territory, but not that much territory. But the reparations that were demanded of the German government of Weimar were massive. And the problem all through the 1920s, sympathetic British and American economists are trying to come up with a formula that will allow Germany to make payments to Britain and France, but still maintain a healthy economy. And in fact, the reparations, that's still a question debated by historians. To what extent did the Allied demand for reparations embodied in the Versailles Treaty affect a healthy Weimar economy and limit Weimar's ability to become a more sustainable republic? Because economic problems plagued Weimar Germany throughout its history. And that is a remaining question. And it certainly provided grounds to Hitler. But the key thing to remember, so long as there was some basic economic stability, so long as people could hold a job, could maintain savings, could pay a predictable amount of money for their bread and their meat and their beer, then the Nazi Party was the numbers I showed to you earlier, 1.5% in the city of Berlin. But once that is lost, once the government has to institute severe measures, once jobs are lost, once the banks lose their ability to give money to their customers, loan money, or maintain a standard inflation rate, that's when Hitler is able to capitalize on it. That's when Hitler can say, this form of government doesn't work. And a growing number of Germans are going to, yeah, I think he's right. It hasn't worked for us. Why not try this? And still remember, he still didn't get 50% of Germans to agree with him in the period of free elections.
Okay, no problem. Let's see, we were having a little bit of discussion. Really enjoyed your comments on that famous Russian photo that was taken when Berlin supposedly fell. I actually didn't know the story behind that.
Yeah.
So really appreciate that. That was really fascinating. Thank you.
That all emerged after the wall fell.
Funny how that works.
Funny how that works.
And then let's see. So one thing that some people might not realize is how many people died trying to get into West Germany. So if you do a Google search, according to various sources of the internet, it says 140 people died trying to cross the Berlin Wall, and 600 people that they know of trying to cross over into West Germany in total. And so, I think that's important for, say, Americans. We can kind of take our freedom for granted sometimes. Right. But imagine someone, a relative or a friend or a family member dying, trying to get out of.
Trying to get out. Yeah. There's the film, one of the films you mentioned earlier, Berlin Tunnel. That's with Heido Ferch, a German film that you can buy, I think, or you can find with English subtitles. That's very good for showing the realities of tunneling. Mm-hmm. There's also a film, an American-made film that was made in the early 80s, starring the American actor who played John Boy in The Waltons.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yeah, there's a
balloon.
Film, yes, that's a very good film as well, because it shows a man dying in the tunnel from the collapse of the walls.
Uh-huh.
So you have to, the victims included people, and we might not know, there might have been people who died in such tunnels who haven't been discovered yet.
Yeah, or they weren't, the authorities didn't find out about it.
They didn't know about them. So yeah, 140 died that we know of trying to get into West Berlin. Others died of heart attacks. That is, they were stopped, they were caught by, especially older people, they were caught in the act of escaping. They would have been imprisoned, but many of them would die of heart attacks because of their efforts or because of the strain of interrogation and that kind of thing. And we don't have exact numbers on all of those as well.
I thought at the museum used to have an exhibit about the Berlin Wall, and I thought there was a case where someone was shot and they were basically left for dead. They weren't dead, but they were dying, and they were just left there to, pass away from their gunshot wounds.
There was a young man, I forget his name offhand, but there was a young man who actually made it. He was actually on the wall when he was shot. He was on the dividing space when he was machine gunned by East German guards. They could not, they were delayed getting to him. Eventually, they did bring him back into East Berlin, but he died hanging over the wire in West Berlin. Part of him was lying in West Berlin. The rest of him was lying in East Berlin. And it took him several hours to die from the wounds he'd suffered. Yes.
Let's see. This was a really interesting question. I don't remember who it was from though. Someone said they visited Germany a while back, like 20 years ago or so, and they according to them, the older generation didn't really seem to want to talk about the Nazis or any of that history, but the younger generation was more interested in discussing that. Have you seen that kind of a different approach to the history depending on a person's generation there?
I've been to Germany many times, and I've talked to German veterans, and the German veterans are willing to talk to me. In part, there's a reluctance to talk to foreigners, because then if you're being interviewed by an American journalist, so how many did you kill? And how many people did you know were murdered and you never said anything about? Now, that's one reason why you'd be a little reluctant. It's hard to describe what life was like. It was hard to describe what it was like under the Nazis. It's hard to describe what it was like under the communists, because you never know when you might be betrayed. You never knew when you might be found, or someone would report you for saying something that you may have said or you may not have said. Mm-hmm. And it's a situation that's very difficult to explain to people who have not lived through it. Let us hope that Americans do not live through such an experience. But yeah, older people who live through that, how do you discuss it? How do you answer? Well, we've got 60 seconds here for you to just give me an answer to these questions. Mm-hmm. How can you answer that in that time? Young people, they're very interested in knowing about it. That's why there's no reticence or reluctance to deal with the past, to talk about the past at the location of the former Gestapo headquarters in Berlin, again, which was right off the Wilhelmstrasse, on Prince Albrechtstrasse was the Gestapo headquarters. That is preserved today, not only as a museum, but as classrooms and meeting places, open air museums that talk about the role of the Gestapo, they've preserved the basement cells, the basement interrogation cells, where people were interrogated in the building before they were sent to other locations. And those have been preserved. People walk every day. People are visiting that. School groups are taken to them and shown that. So yeah, young Germans, they acknowledge this. They deal with it. And I think they've done an incredible job in coping with the past as well as it can be coped with. Mm-hmm. You see the difficulty of that today when you talk about moving monuments in the United States. So, difficulties, the past is a difficult period to cope with when you're talking about, well, the previous generation thought this way. We don't think that way. But then it turns out that some of the grandchildren of that other generation, they still think that way. They don't think those monuments should be removed. So,
okay. What about this? I thought this was a really interesting question. It was from our friend Susie Ellicott. Hi, Susie. Thanks for joining us. She said, did not realize Adolf Hitler disliked or didn't spend a lot of time in Berlin. Makes sense. Did Hitler or anyone else ever consider moving the capital to Munich, where the Nazis got their start, or anywhere else? Has there ever really been any serious talk about moving? I mean, I know when the Berlin was split, they had the West German capital, but what about during the Hitler era? Was there ever talk about moving the capital somewhere else, or was always centered in Berlin?
Well, Hitler recognized that the location of Berlin, that Berlin was a capital city, but what he did want to do was rebuild it and rename it. The city was to be named Germania, Germany, not Berlin anymore. It would lose its identity as Berlin. It would become Germania.
Oh, okay.
You see, there was a TV miniseries called The Man in the High Castle, based on a novel. They made an attempt to reconstruct some of what was planned by Hitler. And the face of Berlin would have been changed greatly, as well as it being renamed. And that construction had already begun, and it was continued while the war is going on. It's like, we're going to rebuild Washington, D.C., even though, we're under, imagine if World War II was happening in the United States, and, we need a new building project in Washington. So, and it's not related to the war. So yes, there was a major plan of his to construct a new highway through the center of the city, one that would in part be above ground, part would be underground. And in fact, if you go to the Tiergarten, there are places where you can go below the Tiergarten and walk into this open space below ground, which is a subterranean driveway, a highway underground, which was completed for a few hundred yards under the Tiergarten. That would have been one of the new thoroughfares to take you through the center of the city without disrupting the city. A lot of properties had already been bought up, demolished. Jewish residents in Berlin were evicted. Their homes were requisitioned and demolished to prepare for part of this reconstruction. So it was not a post-war plan that Hitler had. It was actually underway. And when Soviet forces marched on the Reichstag, they actually had to work through construction sites that were still there from the planned reconstruction of the new Germania of Berlin. So that was Hitler's solution. That his preference was always for South Germany, for the mountains, for Berchtesgaden. That was where he felt at home.
Okay,
but
no
he felt very much. He was a field general. Remember, he was the ultimate field general of all time, as one of the German generals at the time described him. So he spent a lot of time close, or relatively close to the front, in his headquarters in East Prussia, in a separate headquarters in Vinnytsia in the Ukraine, and headquarters that he had in France. So he spent a lot of his time in those locations directing the war. And when he needed a break, he'd go to Berchtesgaden.
Mm-hmm.
And when there was some official function that he had to do in Berlin with involving the Axis powers, or meeting Mussolini, or meeting the Romanian head of state, then he'd go back to Berlin and meet him in the Reichschancellor.
Okay. I read Harry Truman's autobiography, and one of the parts that stuck out with me, he talked about visiting Berlin after the war. And on the one hand, just seeing all this destruction from the war, in particular the Allied bombing campaign. And then the other hand, all the Allied firepower, the mile, and, because all the troops would line up to see him. And so the miles and miles of tanks lining the roads. And so the destruction on one hand, with the paradox of the Allied military
Allied military might.
And the other, yeah. What about, so there was a question that came up, do you know when like the last signs of the war could be seen? Like with they got rid of all the buildings that had been destroyed and built new ones and stuff. Do you know like when the last of kind of the remnants of the war damage were taken away?
Well, as I said, the evidence of the war damage is still there. There is in the suburban part of Berlin in the west, at the Yorkstrasse S-Bahn, which is way out in the suburbs. If you go to that building, if you go to that structure, the base of the foundation for the S-Bahn station, before you go up the steps onto the platform, the base still has the bullet holes from where Soviet forces approached that embankment and fought with German forces there. There's been a conscious effort to kind of preserve those battle signs throughout Berlin, where they are on buildings that are in good enough shape that they don't suffer the risk of further damage from that. But yes, I mean the older buildings were all demolished, as soon as it was convenient. In East Berlin, the ruins remain much longer. West Berlin was very good about cleaning that up with Allied assistance. Mm-hmm. East Berlin, they let things kind of lie, and that was point. So look at the damage that we brought upon ourselves. You must never forget that. But I'll give you an example of a personal story from a Berlin woman I knew, that they were in an area where it was close to the center, but still in a residential area. In the center of their street, a German tank, an old Mark IV tank, had been dug into the street. They dug up the asphalt and buried the tank as kind of a permanent pillbox against.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Right. So the Germans, they manned the position as long as they could, and they were either killed or they ran away. And it was it was under Soviet occupation before the Americans arrived, and the Russians just left it there. We didn't do anything. Within 3 days of the American forces moving into the city and occupying their sector in the west, they got rid of the tank, paved over where the spot was, and the Germans. That's very impressive. So they've got a good sense of organizing and cleaning things up, because the Germans were not in a position to do anything, to clean anything up at that point, 1945. So that's one example of an appreciation for what the Americans could bring when they first arrived in Berlin.
Okay. And then, so what about if someone comes to Washington, D.C., let's talk about food for a minute. So if someone comes to Washington, D.C., they can have a half smoke, or if you go up to Baltimore, you can have some blue crabs. Is there any like Berlin-esque food? I mean, I know people are probably familiar with German food, but is there anything that's kind of unique to Berlin as far as food goes?
Currywurst.
Oh, and what's that?
Currywurst. It's sausages, small sausages with curry, and there's part of that is a Turkish legacy. Now, once East Berlin sealed itself off, and East Berliners could no longer travel to West Berlin to work, that's a time when West Berlin and West Germany began inviting Turkish workers, especially to do the construction work that needed to be done in West Berlin. And they brought a lot of curry with them, especially for spicy for their foods. And that became something of a Berlin specialty, currywurst, the very hot sauce on wurst, if you like that.
Wow, no, I never.
Currywurst.
I never heard of that.
Yes, if you go to Berlin today and you expect to find schnitzel or any kind of the traditional the meats that you'd find in Bavaria, in Munich, you're going to have to do some looking to find a restaurant that offers that. You'll find plenty of Thai restaurants, Vietnamese restaurants, Turkish restaurants, of course, all manner, Greek restaurants, Argentine restaurants. If you want really good cooked beef, there's all kind of Argentine restaurants in Berlin. And that was there. That goes back to at least 1980 when I was going there.
Okay.
So you'll find a wide range of cuisine in Berlin.
Okay. And then I'm not, I think I know what this is. Deborah asked, is the lipstick and cosmetic case still there? I was there in 1982 and I Googled those and I
Yes.
see pictures of them, but I'm not sure if they're still, I can't tell if they're still there.
Yes, they're still there. They're still exactly in their old location. The Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche. The Kaiser Wilhelm, that's not for Kaiser Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm I, excuse me, memorial church. It was a very nice church that was built before World War I, and it was then destroyed by bombing in World War II and further damage. And then again, they preserved the ruin of that church. Today, there's still services held around that, but the lipstick case, and that was a building constructed immediately adjacent to the old Gedächtniskirche. And that's kind of a museum to serve the same purpose. And that's what the lipstick case, that's still there, still in its location in it's on the Kudamm, in what was the center of old West Berlin. Now that became unfashionable after reunification, and Stadtmitte around Friedrichstrasse, that became the in place, and Prenzlauer Berg, that became a very popular place. That was in former East Berlin. But now the Kudamm, the old Kudamm, if you went to Berlin when it was West Berlin, you knew the Kudamm. That was the fashionable area. That was the shopping area. That's where all the good restaurants, the great shopping locations were. That's coming back. That's being restored because they've built up everything they can in Stadtmitte and Friedrichstrasse. So now they're going back to the Kudamm.
Okay. All right. That makes sense. What about, here's another interesting question from Pamela. She wants to know about, after the wall came down, was there a specific effort to kind of eliminate the disparity between East Berlin and West Berlin? And what about today? Can you tell much of a difference? If someone just blindfolded you and dropped you in the middle of Berlin, would you be able to tell if you're in the East Berlin versus West Berlin anymore?
Not really. You would be able to tell where you were in areas where immigration has been heavy, especially the Middle East, refugees and immigration from the Middle Eastern countries from the 90s, not from the period after Berlin was unified as a city again. Kreuzberg, for example, looks very, very different. It was fashionably run down. Let's put it that way. Kreuzberg was an area, but it was in West Berlin, and it was fashionably run down in the 80s, 70s and 80s, counterculture area. It's not a counterculture area now, except that it's a different culture. And it's not so fashionably run down anymore. But that's in West Berlin. East and West, I was in East Berlin. There are areas in East Berlin that are still dicey, have high crime rates that you would not have in West Berlin. But if you go to Treptower Park, which is again in East Berlin, and there's a giant Soviet memorial there, a very nice park that's bordered on the Spree. I could not tell that from the Tiergarten. I made a specific point. What do you have here that's not in the Tiergarten? There might be a fewer food stands, but there is a McDonald's in Treptower Park in former East Berlin. So I would say it took a while for East Berlin to try to catch up. You still have Soviet-style apartment buildings, which are not very attractive architecturally to begin with. They're still very present, but they've been spruced up. They've been renovated. They've added a lot more. I would say East Berliners have a much higher standard of living than anything they had before. But there's still a wall I'd say in the minds, that East Berliners still have a tendency to think of loyalty to the regime. And that's not just to the East German regime, but going back to that area was the stronghold of the Social Democrats when they were a revolutionary party.
Mm-hmm.
In 1912, the city elections, it was the first time the Social Democrats were allowed to participate as a legal party. They'd been banned as a party in the late 19th century. 1912, they're allowed to participate. The vote in the city of Berlin was 75% for the Social Democrats in 1912.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of overwhelming. That
Mm-hmm.
and that was centered in what was East Berlin. So when you say East Berlin, you're not just talking about the former communist governed area of the city. You're talking about what has been traditionally, since the beginning of the 20th century, a political stronghold of the left. And so it's just kind of, it's in the DNA to kind of vote left, despite the fact that you're living a lot better than anybody of if you were part of a fourth generation Berliner living in East Berlin, and you're living a much better lifestyle than any of your previous 3 or 4 generations, you're still kind of going to vote the way they did. That's
okay.
An impression.
Okay, makes sense. What about, let's go back for a moment to 1989. So big, important date in history, the Berlin Wall came down. Was that just kind of an inevitable thing was going to happen, or did that just really catch everyone by surprise? Because I kind of remember that time frame, but my brother actually moved out of state when that was taking place, so I was kind of focused on that side of things, and it was a while ago. And was that like an inevitable thing was going to happen, or did that catch like the White House and everybody else by surprise when it came down so quickly? Because there were rumblings that things were changing over in Eastern Europe, but that came down pretty quickly.
If you look at it long term, you could argue that it might have been inevitable given the economy of the Soviet dominated Eastern Europe countries, that their economies were terrible, that there was absolutely no environmental concern, that a lot of the jobs that were created were simply make work jobs that were not related to any productive economic activity whatsoever. So you can argue from the long range term that perhaps it was inevitable, but no one thought that in 1989. It was not simply a shock, it was not a surprise, it was a shock, and it was even a mistake, because if you follow what actually happened on the day that the wall came down, November 9th, 1989, there had been a directive. They were beginning to loosen some of the restrictions because there'd been a lot of grassroots opposition and growing opposition within East Germany. And people were leaving, they were getting out, going through Hungary and then going out through Czechoslovakia. So there had been a lot of pressure. And so the East German government was beginning to make concessions, and they were willing to make a concession about limited ability to visit West Berlin. And at a press conference that evening, an East Berlin official misread what he thought the directive said, and he assumed that it meant that, meant that access would be open, not that that was what was intended, but that access would be granted. And then he leaped to I guess it means right now. And so people were suddenly they'd been gathering, they knew something was in the air. And at a particular location on the wall, the word came down and everyone was stunned. And suddenly there's the wall has to come down. See, he just said it. And so the guards were not briefed on this. No one in the East German power structure had been briefed as to what was beginning to happen that evening. And so it became a fait accompli. And no one was willing to shoot down people. That was one of the big differences from the past. No one was willing to shoot down a crowd of people and face what the consequences would be. So they let some people in. And again, the people who wanted to cross, let's go in, let's do some shopping, and then come back. No one was thinking, oh, we're going to move to West Berlin now and live out our lives. The majority of the people who were pushing to get across the wall, the idea was just get over there, visit some relatives, taste some of the food, have the ability to see what was going on over there, and then go back home again. They didn't. No one realized what was actually happening. No one realized what the implications were going to be for the future. So yes, it was both a long-term. You can argue, yes, that the East German economy was in the tank, that it was unsustainable, just as the economies of most of Eastern European countries and Warsaw Pact countries were. But for the moment that it happened, it was a complete shock. No one anticipated it. No one thought it was going to happen. Everyone was surprised.
Okay, so if you could go back in time a few months before that took place, after it had been open that had been up for 28 years, and talk to people in the streets of either East or West Berlin or the White House or the Kremlin, they would all be shocked if you would have told them that the wall was going to come down in November '89. Oh, okay, so that's
if you'd been there in October and said, in 6 weeks that wall's going to be gone, they'd say you're out of your mind.
Really?
You're a hopeless optimist, and the prisons and the madhouses are full of people like you. You're out of your mind. You're not a serious person. That's how they would
have. And then quite a few people were commenting on different places where there's remnants of the Berlin Wall, like at a lot of presidential museums. And there used to be one at the museum. I'm not sure what happened to the one that was at the museum, because that museum closed.
I don't know what happened. Yeah, I remember. I saw that piece. Yeah, of course.
That was actually a really interesting exhibit they used to have there.
Yes. In fact, and there are pieces of the wall and fragments of the wall everywhere in the free world and elsewhere. And there are traces of the wall still in Berlin. There are some of the more, not so affluent residential sections where there's still a few blocks of the wall that still stand because they're in the middle of a woods or something that no one really cares about, or it's communal property. And
wow.
But probably given another 5 years, someone will find a way to they'll sell the bits of the wall and then buy the land and build a condo there.
Well, let's see. So if anyone joined us late, just FYI, this program's being recorded. We'll post it on our YouTube channel. It might take a couple days, though. It's not like it's going to be up there later tonight. I'll send out the link with that. What about Timothy? You mentioned at the start of our program that you were an author as well as doing talks like this. What books have you written?
I've written 3 books. One on German occupation policy in Russia, 1942 to 43, and 2 books on German U-boats. There's a U-boat commander. I live here in suburban Maryland, and less than 15 miles from where I'm sitting now is the grave of a German U-boat commander who was killed trying to escape, and it was basically a suicidal escape from an interrogation center, not really a POW camp, but an interrogation center located at Fort Hunt, Virginia, on the outskirts of Washington in Virginia, near Mount Vernon. And at that location, he was shot and killed on the evening of June 15th, 1944. And I was intrigued by, well, how did that come about? Why did that happen? And that eventually became a book, Lone Wolf, The Life and Death of U-boat ace Werner Henke. He was a U-boat ace. He was not only a U-boat captain, he was a very successful U-boat captain. And he'd been to the United States a number of times in the pre-war period. He was not really a professional naval officer. He joined because he was a merchant marine officer who was out of work in the 30s because of the Depression. And the German Navy opened up its officer candidate ranks to qualified merchant marine officers. So he joined the German Navy, but in his demeanor and his character, he really wasn't, a professional military or professional Navy guy. And he got into trouble all the time. He actually lost, he was kicked out of the Navy officially. He was retained for services, but he lost his professional status because of some of the offenses he committed. But then he became a very successful U-boat commander. and they retroactively kind of cleaned up his record. He was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, which is the largely equivalent to the Medal of Honor, basically. It's where that large black iron cross is worn at the neck. And he was captured with most of his crew by the same US Navy group that would later capture the U-515, excuse me, the 505, and is now on display at the Chicago Museum of Science and Industry. So that was one book on him. And then a second book that followed from that, where I talked about the German U-boat arm as a general instrument, the men of the U-boat. I didn't look so much at, the torpedoes or the technical qualities of U-boats, but mostly who were the men who served aboard German U-boats, especially given their incredibly high casualty rate. And so that second book flowed from the book on Werner Henke. And so those are the three books.
Okay. I posted your Amazon page in the Zoom chat, and then I'll email it out to everyone, because there were a lot of people, you can't see it in the comments, but a lot of people were giving their electronic applause and bravo and great talk and all that kind of stuff. So greatly appreciate that. So just, you brought up, maybe it's not directly related to topic. What's the 60-second synopsis? Where did the U-boat crews come from? Just that's interesting.
They were overwhelmingly working class young men who served. They did 8 years primary school and then went to trade school, or they went straight into apprentice jobs. And this was a way, and the reason why they were doing that, it was a way to move up from the working class to a middle class status, that specialized metal workers. These were guys who were the plumbers, electricians, specialized metalworking skills, locksmiths, men who could look forward to opening or starting their own businesses and getting out of factories as their fathers had been. And so these men moved into, they were moving into or hoping to move into a new social status within German society. And the U-boat arm offered a way of promoting that, because at the time, the U-boats were the cutting edge of technology, especially for engineering, machinery, metalworking skills. That was the way to go. And so a lot of men were recruited on that basis. Others went into the Panzer arm, the tank arm, for the same reason. Cutting edge technology, that's what you wanted. So you didn't have farmers, you didn't have farm boys working in the U-boats. Almost none of them went to university. They all had this background of working class, specialized skills, and a large number of them came from the industrial parts of Germany. They'd never been to sea. They came from the Rhineland, from the Ruhr, from Saxony. So these are guys, it's interesting to see how many of them came from these backgrounds.
But a lot of them didn't get to fulfill that dream, because I would imagine the mortality rate for U-boats was extremely high.
No one expected it would be what it was. But the thing is that they never stopped. They always had volunteers for the U-boats.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I asked one of them who used to live in Canada, what did you think about the mortality? And he said, well, for one thing, we that's not going to happen to us. We knew that things had started going very bad. But we have control over our destiny on our boat. So as long as we've got good people, we'll be okay. It's not going to happen to us. It'll happen to other guys.
Oh, okay.
Which they didn't realize was, meaningless. But secondly, I also asked, I said, well, the civilians were suffering just as much as we were, getting under the bombing. So we didn't feel that we were, we had to do our part. That we had to support our families. That was one huge advantage was that in the U-boat service, you got a lot of furlough time. When the U-boat returned from patrols, you almost always got home leave. German soldiers on the Eastern Front rarely got home leave, but U-boat crews did. And that meant they could help their families, and especially those living in cities that were being bombed, they could help get their families relocated into the countryside. That's one reason why, I'm going to stay in the U-boats because it gives me some benefits.
Okay. And then Margaret brought up that, yeah, we need to also stream the Das Boot movie, which is
yes,
excellent.
yes.
Not really related to Berlin history. What about for the military of the World War II era? Was there more prestige in certain segments of the military? Like if you were in the U-boats or the Luftwaffe, I've never been in the military, but like for instance, in my opinion, the Marines are considered like the cream of the crop of the military in U.S. In my opinion.
Yes. Right? Well, you had
What about for the Germans during World War II? Were there certain areas of the military that were more prestigious than others? Like definitely. The U-boats or like the Luftwaffe or something like that?
Yes, you had a pecking order, and U-boat crews were among the top. I mean, they always had a lot of propaganda about the U-boat crews. Luftwaffe, yes, at first, but then, as the war moved on and the lack of a Luftwaffe to protect German cities, the Luftwaffe kind of lost a lot of its luster. The U-boat crews, when they started especially, they were like astronauts, because they were going off, especially World War I. That was the World War I legacy. A U-boat crewman, especially in World War I, he's on the frontier. He's doing something that's never been done before, going to war in underwater vessels and waging war a long way from home under not only difficult conditions, but unprecedented conditions, fighting at sea, under the sea. So there was a prestige of like a technological elite. That's part of the appeal of the submariners, that they're a technological elite as well as a combat elite. In order to operate a submarine effectively, you have to know what you're doing with the technology of a submarine, as well as be an effective warrior. So that's part of the pecking order of U-boat crews being very high on that list. The Air Force, the Luftwaffe was also high. The tank crews, they were the elite within the Army.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So I apologize. Now where people are asking questions that don't have anything to do with your original topic of Berlin, but here's an interesting question. How is Rommel considered in Germany? Because if you were to ask just random Americans who they know from the German military, he'd probably be the most famous person. But how is he regarded in Germany? Is he considered a great general or not so much? Or any thoughts on that?
Right at the present, most Germans don't even think about it. I mean, there's absolutely no thought about him. There's the most recent event I saw that related.
Not like a Robert E. Lee type of figure.
No, because the memory was cut off with reunification. West Germany used to remember, because they were the direct heirs. The West German government accepted we are the heirs, whether we like it or not, to the Reich government. And therefore, we have to pay pensions to the people who served in the military. We have to assume the responsibility of debts that were incurred during the Third Reich. So you had an identification. You would try to identify people in the military who were acceptable. Erwin Rommel had a destroyer named after him. Erwin Rommel had air squadrons named after him.
Because at least in America, he's really like the only well-known German general.
That's right.
He was, for whatever reason.
During World War II in Germany, most German generals sneered at him. They thought he was a pure opportunist and not very capable, that he was way too politically connected to Hitler, because that's how he started off. And they always thought he was overrated, that the propaganda people always they ignored what was going on in Russia because that was not going well, and instead focused on what was going on in Africa, which was good for a while. There was a slogan or a little ditty in German army circles: in Afrika, in Russland kämpft das deutsches Heer. In Africa gibt's ein Feuerwehr. And what that loosely translated is, well, the German army is fighting for its lives in Russia, and there's a fire brigade running around in North Africa. That's the average assumption about Rommel's Africa Corps, that this was all a hyped up, overrated group of guys who were fighting on a very secondary front, whereas the German army in Russia was fighting for its lives. But to go back to today's Germans, there are no German destroyers today that are named after Rommel. There are no German air squadrons in the Luftwaffe named today after Rommel. There's a complete dissociation. Anyone who served in the German military in World War II is someone we don't want to acknowledge or recognize. Okay. We treat the whole era as basically contaminated, and even guys who did commendable things. The only group who would be recognized still are the conspirators, the men who tried to kill Hitler and who died, who paid with their lives for it. And Rommel actually is argued about, well, was he one of those men or not? But in today's Germany, no one cares. It's just not an issue that that anyone's going to get upset about. The most recent thing that happened is someone put up, there is a monument to Rommel in his hometown, near Ulm, not in Ulm, but near Ulm. And someone proposed to paint a shadow on the monument. And what was that shadow? What was that? It was to signify the victim of landmines in Libya and Tunisia and partly Egypt, that because landmines were laid so heavily by both the Axis, the German and Italian forces on one side, and the British forces on the other, that many, many Libyans, Tunisians, Egyptians lost their lives, lost their limbs from World War II ordnance that remains out in the deserts and near some of the towns. And that's, an event that very few Americans or British or Germans hear about. So one individual he decided this was a striking way to do it, paint a shadow of a landmine victim on the memorial to Rommel. And I don't know whether it was approved or not, but nobody had any real strong objections. I know that.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Well, let's see. So we've kept you for quite a while over our original time, just because of all the questions you had from our big audience.
Yes, that's fine. That's fine. Well, glad people are interested.
Oh yeah, no, it was great. Like I said, you couldn't see all the electronic applause and clapping. You got, and there's really a lot of questions that people had, which is interesting, is because, Germany, a country maybe for Americans, we maybe know a little bit more about than, some other parts of the world. So that was really outstanding. Before we sign off, any final thoughts for the evening or anything else you wanted to add or mention?
The only thing I want to say is I hope that people would have a better grasp of Berlin's history and character than they might have had otherwise before tonight. And that I hope that some of the images, at least, are brand new and might be something that you might want to look for when you can get back to Berlin.
Oh yeah, no, that was excellent. Well, Timothy, that was a tremendous job. Thank you so much. Like I said, if you joined us late, this program's being recorded. It'll take a couple days probably to load it up to YouTube because I have some other things to take care of first. But I'll email that out along with the link for Timothy's Amazon page. Timothy, are you doing any other talks that you know of in the near future that are open to the public in any capacity that you know of?
Not in the near future, but I've done some straight World War II type talks. I did a 2-part talk on the Battle of Britain, 1940, and then a 2-part talk on the Allied air offensive against Germany, 1943 to 44, and what they were accomplishing. Did strategic bombing work? How well did it work?
Okay.
And so forth. So I've done some military history type talks, and.
Well, excellent. Well, I hope you can come back and I'll send you email. I hope you come back and talk to our group again, because you really got a great response from everyone.
If you want to show some of those movies, I can do a commentary. That's something else.
Oh yeah, no, I would definitely like to do that. So
like gospel.
Okay, well, thanks everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your evening. Stay safe, and we'll see you all next time. Thanks, Timothy.